Namaste and hello. This is your Sanskrit instructor welcoming you back into lesson number 144. If you are struggling between the difference on when it is appropriate to use the active voice and when it is appropriate to using the passive voice, this lesson should be helpful to you. In this lesson, we are going to get comfortable with the change of voice. In other words, we are going to learn how to convert a sentence in the active mood to the passive mood, and then after that, we will learn how to convert a sentence from the passive mood to the active mood. First, we will start with how to convert a sentence from the active to the passive voice. It should be voice. I keep on saying mood, but the active voice to the passive voice. And there are some guidelines that are as follows. The nominative and the active voice becomes an instrumental. The accusative of the active voice becomes a nominative. The verb changes from the active to the passive and agrees in person and number with its subject. And the tense or mood of the active voice must be preserved. There is an example below here that follows these guidelines, and the example is as follows. So let us take a look at the two sentences. You have an example sentence on the right hand side. We have arrows pointing in both directions that divide these two columns. So on the left-hand side, we see the active voice. The example sentence is the king conquered the enemies. On the right-hand side, we have an example of a passive voice, and that is the enemies were conquered by the king, if you read that not from top to bottom, but from the other way around. As you can see, the first rule here is that the nominative of the active voice becomes an instrumental, and that is exactly what we're seeing here. So in the active voice, the king conquered the enemies. The king is the subject of that sentence, and that is why it is in the nominative case in the form of nripaha. But since the enemies seem to be the subject in the passive voice because the enemies were conquered by the king. The king turns from, in the active voice, from nominative to the passive voice in the instrumental case. So it turns from nripaha to nripirna. Next, conquered. So conquered is ajayat. The king conquered the enemies. So who conquered? The king did. So that's why the word conquered is agreeing with the word the king. So the king is singular. So if the king is the one that is doing the conquering, that's why the root word G is going to be in the imperfect because it's conquered with an ed. Imperfect, third person, singular. It's third person singular because of the king. Now, notice how the verb changes from the active to the passive voice. The agreement is with that in the nominative case. That is what your verb is agreeing with. So in this sentence, since the enemies seem to be the subject in the passive voice, that is why the word were conquered is agreeing with the enemies this time instead of the king. Ajiyanta, that is passive, imperfect, third person, plural. Plural for more than one enemies that were being conquered. And again, this agrees with the statement that the verb changes from the active to passive and agrees in the person and the number with its subject. And that subject is represented by whatever is in the nominative case, and the tense or mood of the active voice must be preserved. Then finally, the enemies the king conquered the enemies. That's the object of the sentence. Arin turns into, it becomes the subject in a passive voice sentence, the enemies, to areyaha. So notice that the king conquered the enemies in the active voice, and the enemies were conquered by the king. Both of these sentences have the same meaning, but they are just said in a different voice. So you end up with, for the active voice, nripaha ajayat arin becomes nriporin ajayat. And then for the passive voice, you have nripirna ajiyanta arayaha becomes nripinaryo jiyanta. Now that we learned how to change a sentence from the active voice to the passive voice, now we will learn how to change a sentence from the passive to the active voice. And these guidelines are basically the opposite of the previous guidelines that we went over, converting the active voice to the passive voice. It's just the other way around. And the guidelines are as follows. The instrumental agent of the passive voice becomes a nominative. The nominative of the passive voice becomes an accusative. The verb changes from passive to active and agrees in person and number with its new subject, and the tense or mood of the passive voice must be preserved. So the first two guidelines is basically the opposite of what we just previously learned, and we have an example changing a sentence from the passive voice to the active voice. The example sentence in the passive voice, this time the passive voice is on the left-hand side and the active voice is on the right-hand side. The example of the passive voice is, the well should be protected by the two of you. In the active voice, it turns around to say, you two should protect the well. Again, notice that the well should be protected by the two of you. So by the two of you is in the instrumental case. That's why you have your vabhyam. But then in the active voice, it changes it to the nominative case. You two should protect the well. Nominative, dual. That's why it becomes yovam. Now the well, nominative, the well should be protected. The well appears to be the subject of the sentence. That's why it is in kupaha. But it is the object. You two should protect the well in the active voice. It's the object in an active voice type sentence. And that's why it changes from nominative to accusative. Kupam, the well. Then, last but not least, you have should be protected. That is in the potential tense, passive voice. That's why we have rachyeta turns into should. And notice that rachyeta, the well should be protected. Rachyeta is third person singular, because third person singular, that singularity is being represented by the well. But notice in the active voice, we have should protect. Racyetam, that is dual, that is agreeing with you two, the two of you should protect the well. So that verb is agreeing with whatever is in the nominative case. In this, in the active voice, you too is in the nominative case. So that's why it becomes in the active potential mood. We have rakshetam. So that is why for the passive voice, you would have yovabhyam kupaha rakshyeta. It will become yovabhyam kupo rakshyeta for the passive voice. And then for the active voice, you would have yovam kupam rakshetam. And then you will end up with yovam kupam rakshetam by the time you're adding all of your sandhis. Notice that those has the anuswar. So these are the conditions from converting something from the active to passive and the passive to the active. And this is your Sanskrit instructor signing off with a namaste.